born in the wrong era. It's a very interesting concept if you think about it. A lot of people take for granted what the 21st century has to offer. A lot of technology, a lot of medical and educational advancements for women and men. But some of us feel like we were born in the wrong era. Um, Specifically, myself and a few other people I know, we always talk about how the Middle Ages would have been a better time, a better place to live in because it has fantasy aspects, it has stories, and it was a very simpler time to live in. This thought always occurred to me when I came to class because we all had something in common. We all had this undeniable urge to explore what the Middle Ages were. And I started asking myself why. Why the Middle Ages? If you're a history major or a history buff or anything to do with history, you'll know the Middle Ages weren't the greatest time to live in. Not a lot of medical leeway there. Women didn't really have any rights. Men would go out and fight and come back with missing limbs that were just cut off in battle, things like that. But there's this urge to explore the Middle Ages, and it's an interesting concept if you think about it. It's just why? It's basically what my final project is. Why the Middle Ages? Why do we all have this thought that it was some glorious time of enlightenment and beautification and fantasy and chivalric men and everything like that? And it's an interesting thing to look at because if you interview just random people, they'll tell you what they truly believe was the Middle Ages. They'll think that those fantasy elements were real. They'll give you reasons like the King Arthur tale and Robin Hood and quest-driven men and very timid and proper ladies and things like that, which were the Middle Ages, but they weren't. I did a series of interviews with a couple friends of mine. Two of them were gamers. One of them is a book blogger. Actually, three of them are book bloggers. One of them talks about books specifically, and two of them talk about TV shows. And they all gave very interesting, very similar, but very different reasons why they are drawn to these books or video games or TV shows or movies. They're all very romanticized ideas, and we really have a favoritism for that word in class. It is something that most of us didn't realize we were doing to the Middle Ages until we really started to discuss it. In one of the interviews with Natalie, she talks about the Game of Thrones TV HBO show and also the book by George R. R. Martin. And she talks about the fantasy elements, which is really shocking because I thought I would get that from another interview, which I didn't get it in. She talks about the dragons and the magic, wizards, and swords, and escaping from the real world. And I think that's what they all have in common. All of these video games, TV shows, and books, they all let us escape from reality, which is an interesting concept because reality isn't really that bad. Yes, there's debt and war and lack of jobs, but really if you think about it, it doesn't affect us all too much if we don't allow it to. And all of the people I interviewed, they decide to take a step back and engulf themselves in this medieval type of setting. And one of the main common reasons was to escape reality. The Middle Ages was the real world, but to them, it's not. It's a fantastical, far-off land that could exist, it couldn't exist. There are aspects to it that do exist. They fantasize about princesses and kings and queens and knights and quests and chivalry and all this sorts of stuff that is really embedded in us from media. It's just really what it is. Especially Game of Thrones and TV shows like Merlin and even Sherlock Holmes. it's all very modern but not modern. There are modern ideas, but there's very ancient ideas as well, very medieval ideas. And the 21st century has a really bad habit of romanticizing those ideas and trying to use it to sell product. And I think that's what had happened when I had interviewed a lot of people. They were really driven by these ideas of quests and of fantasy elements and of what the media has told them about the Middle Ages. Not any of them were history students. I myself am a history student, and I can think about asking these questions and thinking of my own answers. I would ask them, why the Middle Ages? Why these medieval games? Why these books? And I think to myself, I'm thinking of romanticized ideas um, like a love story of Guinevere and King Arthur. It's a perfect example. I always look for that type of stuff. It's a very romanticized idea. It's a very 21st century idea. Also, a very 21st century idea is having a quest-driven storyline and being able to choose a female knight. That would never happen in the Middle Ages, ever. But it's sold to us, and we always want to root for that underdog. And because it takes place in the Middle Ages, it's one of those ideas that, oh, this is going to be an adventure, it's going to be epic, it's going to be quest driven, it's a woman, so it's going to be very different. There's going to be magic, there's going to be dragons. All of that stuff really plays into what the 21st century is telling us what is medieval. Now, it could be a neo-medieval concept where they're trying to sell a product to us and they're using the Middle Ages because it was an enchanted and graceful time and you could really, really use a lot of things. The Middle Ages ranges from the 1100s all the way up to the 1800s. Like, there's a really wide range of things you can use. So it's really interesting to see this type of response from these interviews. One of the shocking things I found in my interviews, though, was when I talked to a book blogger friend of mine from Toronto. Her name is Giselle. She reads a lot of these fantasy books. She reads a lot of these medieval quest-driven books with female heroines and things like that. But the one thing that she really liked about them were that the men were manly and the women were in women's stations. So, excuse me, the men would go out and it would be a quest, they would go out and slay the dragon or whatever, and the women would stay home and raise the children and raise a family and be there when they got back and had dinner on the table. Like, it was very, their roles were very average. It was very correct of the time frame. She didn't want the female heroine to go off and do battle. She wanted her to stay home and she wanted her to raise children and raise a family and do that and leave that part to the men. It was a very different concept because a lot of books that are pushed on book bloggers and the young adult genre, even the adult genre, is that the main characters are female heroines in some way. The only book I can think of that doesn't do this is the Outlander series by Diana Gabaldon. It is a series of a nurse from 1945 that's thrown back into 16th century rebellious Scotland and falls in love with a Highlander rebel. That's it. There's no fantasy aspects. That's just it. It's the setting, basically, that makes it medieval. And that's another thing that a lot of my interviewees love, the setting aspect of castles and cathedrals, and they use words like archways, flying buttresses, gorgiles, things like that, that they may not specifically know. If I showed them what it was in a picture, they probably wouldn't be able to say, yes, that's a flying buttress, but they would list those types of things because they've seen them in movies or TV shows or they've heard it in a book or something like that. Like, it's very word associated. So it's very interesting that these interviews really gave me a lot to work with what people nowadays think was the Middle Ages and their reasoning of why they love these types of TV shows, books, and video games was those types of things. Like, it's not all fantasy driven, it's not all preconceived notions from media. It's a lot of embedded knowledge from when we were children, when we were taught the Middle Ages in grade 4 or whenever we were taught it for history class. And sometimes when we try and do our own research or do our own digging into what the Middle Ages were, sometimes we have fact and sometimes we have fiction, and sometimes we confuse the two of them because we want to romanticize these ideas.